Muted there. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Truthcast show. Today we have a special guest on, Dr. Paul Copan. We're going to talk about his book, Is God a Moral Monster, as well as discuss a few other things in the realm of Christian apologetics and philosophy. Paul Copan is at the PhD in philosophy from Marquette, I believe, University. Is the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University, West Palm Beach, Florida. He has also helped establish the new MA in Philosophy of Religion at PBA. For 6 years, he served as president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. He is author and editor of over 40 books, including works such as the Routledge Companion to Philosophy of Religion, A Little Book for New Philosophers, Is God a Moral Monster, and Is God a Vindictive Bully? He has also contributed essays to over 50 books, both scholarly and popular, and he has authored a number of articles in professional journals. In 2017, he was a visiting scholar at Oxford University. Paul and his wife, Jacqueline, have 6 children, and they reside in West Palm Beach, Florida. His website is www.paulcopan.com. And you can also follow him on social media. Paul, great to have you on. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to have a discussion here with me today.
Thank
How
you,
are
Michael.
you doing?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, sir. So this is the book we're going to talk about today, Is God a Moral Monster? A great read. It's not really long, but it's packed full of so much information. And I had to read it twice to really get stuff. And I still feel like I didn't get everything that I could have from it. So it was very informative, very enlightening, to say the least. And tell me a little bit, before we get into the book and everything, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you come to Christ first off, and how did you, what made you go into philosophy in particular?
Right. Well, just very briefly, grew up in a Christian home and was very much exposed to a biblical foundation for thinking about the way things are. And so I'm grateful for the biblical literacy that was part of my life. I came to faith through really the ministry of apologetics. I had in high school, was exposed to Christian apologetics, and it helped me to realize more clearly that the things that my parents talked about and raised us to believe actually were not just made sense in my heart, but actually corresponded to reality very, very wonderfully. That it was objectively grounded in reality, what had happened in history, evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and so forth. So that really helped solidify my faith, my understanding of the Christian faith, and that the Christian faith is the story of reality. And I did an undergrad in biblical studies at Columbia International University, went to Trinity Seminary to get a Master of Divinity degree, happened to take a philosophy elective while there, and then went on to get a master's in philosophy in addition to my MDiv. And then after serving on a church for 6.5 years in upstate New York, I ended up going to get a PhD in philosophy at Marquette University. And just been involved in philosophy, and have really seen the importance of bringing together both biblical studies, theology, philosophy, and operating in those spheres. So I really am grateful that I've had the training in these areas, and have engaged in writing books like Is God a Moral Monster and Is God a Vindictive Bully, that draws on all three of those strands of training.
Okay, yeah. That's very interesting. So, what kind of motivated you to want to seek out a deeper understanding of philosophy compared to, let's say, going a theological route or pastor route or something of that sort?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was planning on doing missionary work even while I was at Trinity Seminary, and even beyond. But the Lord opened up other doors. But what led me into philosophy was this course that I took with Stuart Hackett at Trinity Seminary. actually he had been a mentor to William Lane Craig and actually a colleague
Oh,
of
okay.
William Lane Craig's. So Bill Craig was also teaching at Trinity Seminary at the time.
Oh, wow.
And so I took this class and realized this answers a lot of questions for me. It helped to push me to think more deeply. It was it gave me a lot of helpful categories to not only think through, but also anchor my faith more sturdily. And it also gave opportunities for sharing the Christian faith. I found that as I was having had a degree in philosophy, gave me a lot of open doors that I otherwise would not have had. So it just turned out to be, I mean, apart from enjoying philosophy in and of itself, it also proved to be a real door opener for me when it came to gospel conversations. So I'm grateful for that overall.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit of the background to how I got into the philosophical realm. But hopefully that's gives a little bit of insight.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like the philosophy was definitely a little bit more transformative, so to speak, in your understanding of the scriptures. I notice even for myself when I'm reading deeper, more challenging books and stuff, even like your own, it's really transformative and it really enlightens and actually helps, like you said, establish my faith even more so, grounds it better. And I always try to tell people that oftentimes in the Christian church, we find, you find sometimes that people are afraid to venture out too far because they're afraid they're going to be led away. And I'm like, well, it depends on the type of books you actually engage in. And, I always recommend people, well, like your book, Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, good books to start with and to better understand the scripture and get it grounded, then kind of venturing out from there and picking. That way you have your foundation.
Right.
And then you can start adding some other ideas in there without being led so-called astray.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's like what J.P. Moreland, the Christian philosopher, has said. He said that the mind is like a muscle, and the more you exercise it, the better you become at thinking and processing. So yeah, that's the right way to encourage people to think more deeply about their faith and to be able to give robust answers to people who ask.
Yeah. And you have any events coming up? I thought I saw something on.
Yeah, I mean, I will be in Oxford in this summer. I'll be speaking. I'll be speaking at one of the colleges at Oxford, but also I'll be speaking at the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford. I'll be speaking on C.S. Lewis and the Imprecatory Psalms on May 22nd. May 24th. Tuesday, May 24th. So yeah, I'll be there. I've got a number of other speaking obligations that are lining up for the late summer and early fall. I'll be in Colorado, latter part of July, be in California in August and September, and then have speaking engagements in North Carolina, in Texas, in Denver in the fall. So
where at in Texas? Anywhere close?
I'll be in Lubbock, Texas.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, good deal. I'll try to make a drive out there to meet you in person at that point.
All right. Sounds good.
What exactly do you teach at the university, correct?
Right. I'm a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. I have an endowed chair, which means I have a lighter teaching load, so I can devote more time to writing and editing books, to speaking, and representing the school in that way. So it's been a very good arrangement. I'm very grateful for it. So anyway, that's why I'm able to do some traveling. So that's a little bit of the about my position. But I teach both undergrad classes at Palm Beach Atlantic University. We're starting up an undergrad major in apologetics in the fall. And we just started up a Master of Arts degree in philosophy of religion this past August. So we have Paul Gould, the author of Cultural Apologetics, who is directing the program, a great, just a great scholar, and also Brandon Rickapaw, who just joined us, came from Baylor University, and he's co-authoring a book with J.P. Moreland on substance dualism. So he's and working on a couple of other books too, but he's done a lot of work in the area of the mind-body issue, and also has done a lot of good work in the issue of in the matter of spiritual formation. So we've got a great major at PBA. So come check us out, undergrad and grad, and we just would love to have you as part of our community.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. You have any books in the work currently yourself? As far as that?
Yeah, I do have a book coming out in September with InterVarsity IVP Academic. It's 4 views on war, peace, and violence. And so that's an edited book. And then I have this other book, a follow-up to the Moral Monster book called Is God a Vindictive Bully? And it addresses, basically it's a matter of reconciling the portraits or the portrayals of God in the Old and New Testaments. And so I deal with criticisms coming from both without the Christian faith, like Richard Dawkins and other atheists, but also emphasizing, looking at the critics from within, people like Greg Boyd and Peter Enns and Eric Seibert, who make a distinction between the God, the textual God and the actual God in the Old Testament. That even when it says this is what the Lord says, these authors will say, well, no, God didn't really say that. That was not what God said. That was just Moses or Joshua saying what their fallen, violence-prone, ancient Near Eastern cultural lens prompted them to say. And so what I try to do is show how that is a faulty distinction, that it doesn't work, and it's utterly refuted by Scripture itself. That kind of a reading is only a highly selective reading that doesn't deal with the broader scope of the Scripture. So I go into a lot of detail on that, but I deal with new issues different from the Moral Monster book, like Elisha and the 2 bears, or the slaying of the firstborn of Egypt, or Uzzah being struck dead when he touched the ark, or the imprecatory Psalms, or God's hardening Pharaoh's heart, and a host of other issues, and as well as building on themes of warfare, slavery, and the issue of patriarchy in the Old Testament. So I look at those and add fresh material, building on what I had written in the Moral Monster book, and also my follow-up book on warfare in the Old Testament with Matthew Flanagan called Did God Really Command Genocide? So that's like a little triad of books that I've worked on. Is God a moral monster? Did God really command genocide? And is God a vindictive bully? Spoiler alert, the answer to all of those is no.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah. Now, what motivated you to go in this route? Were you personally struggling with trying to figure it out yourself, or kind of a mixture of stuff there? Or?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, of course, a lot of these questions, they stay in your mind. You're growing up with them, and maybe you don't even think about them as deeply. But then when people start asking you questions, you start to probe and dig a little bit more deeply. So this has been something that's been of interest to me as I've wrestled with some of these questions, as I've engaged with people who have raised these perspectives. And pushed back on issues. And so we could thank God that some of these new atheists have raised some of these questions. It's because it's important for us to think them through. So anyway, but I did in the late, I guess 2009, I believe, or 2008, I wrote an article for the journal Philosophia Christi, the Journal of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and it was entitled, Is Yahweh a Moral Monster? And it was written in response to a lot of these new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, who were going after the God of the Old Testament. And so I addressed a lot of their misunderstandings and taking verses out of context and so on. And that became an article that was read by a lot of people, and it prompted me to think about doing a little bit more in this area. And that led to my writing the book, Is God a Moral Monster? And it's been a book that is, I think, addressed a lot of questions that people have had. And when I'm asked to speak, I'm often speaking on those topics related to the moral monster theme, which is fine. And it's been good for me to, through a lot of these conversations that I've had, to think more deeply about these issues and to write further on these topics. So there are a number of other things that I'm also working on related to Old Testament ethical challenges. But those are a couple of, like I mentioned, those books, the Vindictive Bully book and so forth. But I'm actually contributing chapters to a couple of other books that have Old Testament ethical challenges as their theme.
Yeah. And it seems, most people I talk to, even that have degrees and stuff in biblical studies, oftentimes try to not really talk about the Old Testament. I've even had some people tell me, they're like, well, that's the Old Testament, that doesn't really matter anymore. And so they kind of veer from that. And I remember this was a few years ago talking to someone about that. And I was like, that just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, there's got to be some type of answers here to help us better understand what's going on, to be able to defend our faith, because it is important. And there's a lot of important stuff throughout the Old Testament, a lot of mysterious stuff as well, I would say. And so that's what prompted me to see your book. I can't remember exactly what I was reading or watching whenever they promoted your book. And I was like, I'm going to get that. And I got it and I read it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I reread it, and it's been about a year or so since I've read it. So
yeah. I know Frank Turek does mention it in some of his talks. So that's how some people have gotten a hold of the book, thanks to his mentioning it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That may be where it came from. It's been several years now. And that stuff kind of goes away after a while. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about your book as far as that goes. I'm not sure where you'd like to start necessarily. Like I said, there's so much information packed within it itself. I'm not sure if you would like to start on something in particular, or
right. Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I'll just give a little bit of a kind of the lay of the land, and it also spills over into my Vindictive Bully book. But what I do is I look at a number of, in this case, the slogans from these new atheists, Richard Dawkins, etc. And I actually use a lot of their statements as my chapter headings. In fact, even the book Is God a Moral Monster and Is God a Vindictive Bully? Those are titles actually taken from the words of Richard Dawkins, the atheist. So thanks, Richard. I appreciate that. And so I'm addressing issues related to kind of preliminary issues of God seemingly being jealous, and that this is somehow immoral or wrong. And I talk about how that's actually, there are two types of jealousy. One is the immature, petty jealousy, and the other one is when there is like a marriage relationship that is infringed upon, where there's a third party that enters in and threatens to disrupt that relationship. Well, jealousy is very appropriate in this sort of a setting, and in the same way with who God is, and the danger of idolatry and how it actually pulls us away from reality itself. And I talk about God. How could God command the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham? So I go into unpacking some of those themes. So I deal with some of these preliminary questions early on, and then I look at themes related to women. Are women seen as inferior in the Old Testament? What about servitude? They have several chapters on that. Does the Bible endorse slavery, and what is even meant by slavery? And I think that a better term is servitude. That it's not. A lot of people associate that with modern colonial slavery or the antebellum South, which is totally different. And so I try to make that clear, but I make it even clearer in my forthcoming book. And then I have several chapters on warfare in the Old Testament. And I argue for things like, well, there's a lot of hyperbolic language, a lot of exaggerated language that is in those warfare texts. And so I talk about, well, what is really going on behind the scenes? Because a lot of people, they'll see this very sweeping language, and they'll say, oh, this is, God is commanding genocide here. And it's, the text actually does not say that. And we have a number of reasons for rejecting that line of argumentation. So those are a few themes that I talk about in the book. And one of the themes that I bring up is that there, even in the Old Testament law or the legislation of the Mosaic law, we see that there are some commands that, as Jesus said, these were permitted because of the hardness of human hearts. So we shouldn't see this as the ideal legislation. But on the other hand, it is legislation that is far superior to what we see going on in the surrounding cultures. And that's why God says in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that when the Israelites actually carry out the law of Moses, that the nations around them will say, what a wise and understanding people this is. And when you look at the worldviews, and I go into more detail on that in this Vindictive Bully book coming out in October, I emphasize I have 2 chapters devoted to these massive worldview differences between Israel's worldview, having come out of Egypt, having come out of slavery, having been aliens in another land, as being a model for how the Israelites then are to treat aliens in their own midst. That they are to regard the most vulnerable, the alien, the orphan, and the widow, as the ones who are to be most carefully attended to in their social life and helping them so that they can't be taken advantage of. And so those are some of the things that I talk about in that book. But I think it's helpful to remember that, one, it's not a utopian ideal, but rather it's a redemptive ideal that surpasses that of the surrounding nations, but moves the Israelites in a redemptive direction to recover the ideals of creation and also to anticipate the coming of the Messiah, who would be the fulfillment of what those institutions and practices and even personages anticipated. So think of the Mosaic law as a booster rocket, that it gets the Israelites going in the right direction. But when its time is done, when its job is completed, when Jesus comes, then it falls away. It's no longer the covenant regulations, as it were. It's not the covenant that they ought to follow as the new people of God. The promise to Abraham through Jesus Christ has been fulfilled, and that means a kind of a rethinking and a reshaping of what the new covenant looks like. It, now that it brings in the Gentiles into the mix, that it's no longer restricted to national boundaries. It's not a government with a king, with a military, with civil laws and punishments and so forth. Things look a lot different because of that in the New Testament.
Yeah. So it's almost like a gradual adaptation of the moral landscape, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I really enjoyed the genocide part, because that is such a complicating, thing to talk about with people, especially, atheists oftentimes bring that up continuously. It's like, oh, look, he's committing genocide, telling them to wipe out these nations. And you did a great job at really explaining that with the Mennonites and Canaanites and so forth. Maybe you can expound on that a little bit more.
Sure. Well, I'll keep things general here in that when it comes to genocide, of course, this suggests targeting a particular tribe or ethnic group precisely because it is that ethnic group. And what the charge of genocide ignores is that there are, these practices that are being carried out that would be considered criminal in any civilized society today. That we would see, for example, the notion of incest or bestiality or ritual prostitution or infant sacrifice as utterly immoral. And for the Israelites to get caught up into the mix of those practices would be detrimental and actually harmful for carrying out its own mission to be a light to the nations and ultimately to bring the Savior into the world and bring redemption to the nations, including those very nations that are engaged in these practices. But so there is a short-term problem that needs to be addressed, but in the end, all the nations benefit from this. And keep in mind too that these are nations that are often treated as friends of the Israelites, or the patriarchs early on in Genesis, where they're living amongst the Canaanites, but clearly the time is not yet right for the Israelites to come into the land. So that's why they have to wait over 500 years before, as Genesis 15:16 says, before the sin of the Amorite has been filled up, before it reaches full measure. So it would have been wrong for the Israelites to take over the land prior to that time. So there was a particular timing issue here. And so it is an act of judgment against the Canaanites, but it is simultaneous with bringing the Israelites into the land, establishing them there with their institutions, practices, so that the coming of the Messiah would make sense as a sacrifice, as a great high priest, as the fulfillment of Israel's own story or narrative. And so again, those are some things that are important to keep in mind. And a lot of people say, well, those poor hapless Canaanites.
Yeah.
Well, keep in mind that those Canaanites were actually were lived in cities that were far better fortified than than the Israelites would have imagined until they went into the land and saw for themselves. They had superior armies. They were far more numerous than the Israelites, and so it actually was an act of trust to go into the land. And no wonder God is telling Joshua and others, don't fear, don't fear. Why? Because they didn't have the from a human point of view, the military might to overcome these armies. They didn't have the numerous peoples that the Canaanites had. Again, they're going into fortified cities that were very daunting. We look like grasshoppers in their sight, they would say. So it was a great act of trust. And so there's obviously something supernatural that's going on here, that God has just given the Israelites, brought deliverance to them from Egypt, the world's superpower of that day. So what God does is he goes onto the turf of this superpower and delivers the Israelites from bondage, and basically counters and undermines and defeats the gods of the Egyptians, as Exodus 12:12 says. So there's a spiritual warfare that is going on here. And so God brings his people out so that his redemptive purposes could be accomplished. And that the Canaanites knew about this God who delivered them from Egypt with the plagues in Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, crossing the Jordan River. So there's 40 years of buildup, so that the Canaanites knew very well who the Israelites were. And if they had any doubts, they could just look at the camp of the Israelites and see a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night over their camp. And so this should have alerted them to the fact that there is something powerful about this God, that this God is one who is not to be tinkered with, a God who is not to be taken lightly. And we read in Joshua chapter 11 that no Canaanite cities were interested in making peace with the Israelites. And I think that's very telling. Rahab, she was part of the joining up the Israelites. She knew what God had done, and so she said, "I want to get on board with the God of reality." There are also Canaanites who were in Shechem in chapter 8. These strangers at the end of the chapter who were part of a covenant renewal ceremony. In that book of Joshua. So they are aligning themselves with the God that they had heard about. The Gibeonites through trickery, yes, but they also came under the care of the Israelites and protection of the Israelites against the Canaanites, who were rising up against them and the Israelites in battle. So much of this was defensive warfare that the Israelites were fighting in the book of Joshua. So again, as you look at the bigger picture, you look at the context, you see that it's a much more nuanced scenario than what a lot of the critics will bring up. that no, this isn't genocide. The Israelites are, God waited patiently for over 500 years. There is gross immorality that is involved here, that there would have been the possibility of making peace with the Israelites, that we see models of that. We see examples of that. The issue was not the Canaanites. The issue was their practices. And if they're willing to renounce their practices, then they could have been aligned with the Israelites. And that's why you have the major commands, say in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 7, the focus is on the focus is on destroying those religious objects, those marks of identity that the Canaanites had. And so the shrines, the Asherah poles, the altars and so forth, all of these things had to be destroyed. Why? Because those were the places where the Canaanites would gravitate to, and that was the place that led to this kind of, those are the places that reminded them of these sorts of practices that the Israelites were to avoid. And so they were to destroy all of those things. And if there were Canaanites who could maintain, would reject their immoral practices, they could live in the land. Yeah. So the issue is not so much Canaanites, because that's a secondary consideration. A couple of scholars, John and Harvey Walton, in one of their books, talk about how the driving out of the Canaanites, and the notion of utterly destroy, that has more to do, they say, with identity removal. That it has to do, he said, like the Nazis, when the Allied forces came in, to Germany, they destroyed the monuments, the flags, they put to death the hierarchy in the Nazi regime. They rejected the ideology of Nazism. And yes, there were soldiers who were killed. There were, yes, maybe some civilians killed, but basically the German nation remained intact. Yeah. And he said, and they say that this is basically what it means to utterly destroy a nation. That is, remove all of those identity markers that, in a sense, defined them. Remove those things, strip them away, and you've basically gutted the pernicious parts. You've removed the sting out of the out of the German people, the thing that had driven them forward. And now it was as though, and basically to remove that Nazi ideology is basically what is meant by that utter destruction. And so John and Harvey Walton go into detail on that. And in my forthcoming book, I look more in detail on, at that word, what it means. Sometimes it can be equivalent to just being in exile, like the Israelites would go into exile. They were utterly destroyed when they went into exile. But of course, the kingdom of Judah remained intact, even though their economic, political, religious, economic structures had been devastated, but the people still remained, largely intact, even though there were some deaths. The nation withstood that, and even though we could call them utterly destroyed.
Yeah, it's essentially a corrupted ideological cleanse, pretty much.
Exactly.
And so, going back to the fortified cities, I remember reading in the book, I'm trying to remember clearly here completely, that you were talking about how most of those fortified cities were actually more military based than they were civilian.
Sure. And that's true. I mean, I think we can mention that, and I do bring that up in my Vindictive Bully book as well. And one of the things that I point out there is that a lot of the, even though it mentions man, woman, young and old, this was kind of sweeping language that was utilized to talk about totality. And I mentioned hyperbole in association with these warfare texts. When you have hyperbole or exaggeration, it uses this, ancient Near Eastern war texts would use this sweeping language. We turned them to ash. They were non-existent. But we know from history that those sweeping claims were not literally true. Sometimes you have a narrow defeat, And you could call it utter destruction
Yeah.
or whatever, turn them to ash. See, what's interesting about the biblical text, though, is it also mentions alongside of utter destruction, and or however that is to be translated,
Yeah.
it also mentions alongside of that lots of survivors. There are Canaanites who continue to live in the land, that there are people who withstood that, and then fled to another city or whatever. The other ancient Near Eastern war texts don't mention those survivors. They treat them as though they no longer exist. And so there's a realism to the biblical text in comparison to the strongly exaggerated texts that don't mention any survivors in those surrounding nations. But I'll give you an example of this, and I go into this in my my book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? But consider the passage where the Israelites fight against the two kings, Og, Sihon and Og, in Numbers 21. And we read about, for example, Og, who's they're fighting against Israelites, wants to pass through quietly, peacefully, but these two kings resist them. But Og, he is fighting against the Israelites, he himself, his sons, and his army. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you see this recounted in the book of Deuteronomy, which often intensifies the language of earlier scriptures, it adds, show them no mercy, destroy, leave alive nothing that breathes, and so forth. So it really intensifies the language. And so it'll add these sweeping, categories and include man, woman, young and old, even though children, women, and the elderly were not even present. So you get to say chapter 3, and it recounts this battle. And it says that, man, woman, young and old were included in this battle. And it's actually just the army that was defeated when you read the kind of on the ground, the more closer to reality text. That this is what is being recounted, and there may be some, I think there's some exaggeration that goes on in Numbers 21 as well. But you see that there are armies that are fighting against each other, and there wouldn't be any women and children present, but yet it throws in that language for rhetorical effect. And we see that elsewhere as well, like when the Amalekites are when they're being attacked. Actually, they attack the Israelites first in chapter 14 of 1 Samuel, and then chapter 15, the Israelites come back and fight against the Amalekites. But even there, it mentions man, woman, young, and old, like in the book of Deuteronomy. But there are no women and children present. For example, and here's something that I go into again in this forthcoming book, so stay tuned. But they have, one of the methods of exaggeration is in these ancient Near Eastern war texts is to mention a localized battle, really where everything is situated, where the pitched battle is going to take place. And then you have language of universal conquest. Okay, and that's clearly the exaggerated part. So in 1 Samuel 15, we have mention of a citadel city. It's called the city of Amalek, and the Israelites are going to fight against the Amalekites under Saul, and so they're about to fight. And it mentions that the Kenites, people who are friendly with the Israelites, these Kenites are also in this citadel city, and Saul sends word to them saying, hey, we're friends. We don't want to fight against you. So the Amalekites are the ones who are, our enemies, and we're going to fight against them. So what do the Kenites do? They get up and leave. Well, clearly there aren't going to be women and children hanging around when they know that there's going to be a pitched battle in the citadel city. So again, and the language is used, we utterly destroyed them, etc. When you get to that text that mentions, get that part where you have universal conquest, it mentions that Saul fights against the Amalekites. Again, this is exaggeration. He's fighting them from Arabia to Egypt. So he's fighting, this massive territory, hundreds of miles. He's fighting against them. And then to reinforce this point of exaggeration, we get to David, who is fighting against the Amalekites again at the end of the book in chapters 27 and 30. So David is fighting a pitched battle, in this localized battle. And then it goes on to say that David fought against the Amalekites from Arabia to Egypt, the same boundaries. Again, the vast territory that's being that is being mentioned here, and again, clearly exaggeration. So what really the focal point is that pitched, localized battle. That's really the focal point, and then the rest is exaggeration. So that's how these ancient Near Eastern texts operate. And I think it's just helpful to keep those sorts of things in mind when we hear those sorts of exaggerations. We hear, sort of those critiques or attacks against the scriptures, that there's a lot more going on here. There's a lot more nuance, a lot more texture. And I think once you start to understand what's going on here, understanding a bit more of the context, you realize something else is happening, that we need to read some of those, however you translate, utter destruction texts with lots of survivors also being mentioned, and also keeping in mind some of these rhetorical devices that were being used in these ancient Near Eastern war texts.
Yeah, and in your book you mentioned how it talks about driving them out oftentimes, and
Right.
And you were talking about how, well, a while ago, that they would have heard about the Israelites coming. And most of the people that would have stayed behind as the Israelites entered the land were more than likely military, while the, women, children, and elderly would have moved to other cities, and kind of, they weren't really as much in the picture as what the text kind of implies sometimes.
Right. Yeah. If you know that warfare is coming, the women and the children are the first ones to be taken out of the out of the picture. And and Richard Hess, who is he wrote a commentary on Joshua and has done some other work, but I've corresponded with him on this whole picture of these cities, and that these cities were of Canaan were really these fortresses. They weren't where the like Jericho, they weren't where the common kind of where you had people who were from different strata of society. Is pretty much from what we know archaeologically. This was where we'd have, say, a regional king, like a local king or military commander, soldiers, administrators, guarding maybe treasure or grain or whatever in these cities, and the people were, these ordinary civilians would live outside of that region. So anyway, those are some things that I talk about. And Rick Hess, he said, I've studied this for decades, and this is really the most solid picture that emerges as you look at the archaeology, as you look at the inscriptions from that period of time. So again, I've tried to do due diligence here to reinforce that. So even in this forthcoming edition, I mentioned that again, and also give a footnote to Rick Hess, who notes these things and saying, well, that's just where the evidence all points. So I think it's worth noting that as well.
Yeah. Well, you did a great job as far as all that goes. Like I said, this book is a wealth of information, and really good, especially with strengthening one's faith as far as that goes. And you mentioned the deal of the critics talking, what's the difference between the Israelites and Islam, modern day Islam, and going out to conquer the world. And you kind of specified how that's, with a one-time ordeal, and it's not perpetual like that of Islam.
Right. Yeah, and I touch on that in the in the Moral Monster book. I go into more detail on that in the book Is God a Vindictive Bully, and have a whole chapter related to that. But some big differences are that one, this is a one-time matter. It's something that is unique in history, in that it's not that these wars are unrepeatable. It is regarding the gift of the land to the Israelite people. Secondly, the Canaanites are themselves wicked, which is far different than than Islam sweeping in to largely Christianized areas and taking them over. Again, that's a different picture as well. Thirdly, we have the message of the scriptures that reinforces this trajectory that was for a period of time, and that the people of God are not to engage in this way to, say, spread the kingdom of God or something on earth. But Muhammad, for his part, he said in his farewell speech, he said, Allah has called me to fight until all people say there is no God but Allah. So here is something that is seen, very forceful. It's ongoing. It's not just for this particular generation. It is something that is worldwide, ongoing. And for the Israelites, you're dealing with a piece of land that is about the size of New Jersey. It's hardly global. It's directed at a particular wicked people, and God waits for over half a millennium before the Israelites can go into the land. Before that time, it would have been wrong for the Israelites to do so. So there is a patient waiting. And also, what is interesting is that the Israelites are going up against very again, foes who have far greater military and numbers and so forth, and Islam is operating according to kind of the growing numbers, enlisting people to help them fight and so forth. So they do have the numbers in their favor as they undertake to fight against these populations and spread Islam by the sword. So those are a few differences that are important to keep in mind. There's more, but you can take a look at the book. Did God really command genocide?
Yeah. No, it's great, like I said. And what other areas of focus do you do besides the Old Testament stuff? What other kind of area do you do? Any of scientific evidence of some sorts, or?
I mean, I've done 3 books on the matter of the Christian faith and science. So that is an important realm of exploration for me. So I did I co-edited the Zondervan Dictionary of Christianity and Science. Edited a 3 views book on the relationship of Christianity and science. And then also co-authored a book on Genesis 1 through 11, which goes into a lot of the scientific evidence, a book called Origins, and it looks at those early chapters of Genesis. So this is an area of interest of mine. Also, I've done a good deal of work on the moral argument for God's existence, that there is a connection between God and objective moral values, human dignity, human rights, and so forth, and that God's existence offers the best explanation to account for these features of value and moral duties and so forth. In contrast to a worldview like naturalism that says that nature is all the reality that there is, but how do you get value out of valueless processes? How do you get moral duties? How do you get ought out of the is of physical processes and so forth? So I try to draw those connections. I've also done work in the area of relativism. I wrote a book called True for You, but Not for Me. And also have done work in general in ethics. So I co-authored a book called An Introduction to Biblical Ethics, published by IVP Academic, which goes into a whole host of issues related to, basically it's structured around the 10 Commandments, but it looks at issues related to, sexuality, homosexuality, transgender, warfare, just war and pacifism, and basic things like marriage and family life. So I talk about a lot of practical applications along those lines, political structures, what is the best political arrangement for nations. So I talk about those things, and but also highlighting the importance of the fact that the church, we're primarily citizens of a heavenly kingdom, although we do have responsibilities in the earthly realm as well. But keeping in mind what our priorities are, that the kingdom of God is one that will endure, even when, say, the United States is no longer exists. I mean, I love America. I'm patriotic. I mean, from nationalistic, I make that distinction in the book. But there is something appropriate about loving your own country, its roots, its heritage, its history. Whether you're an American or whether my dad came from Ukraine, my mother came from Latvia, and so we also celebrated a lot of those things about those nations. So you can do that without, it's sort of like enjoying your own your favorite restaurant or your favorite sports team or whatever.
Yeah.
You can do that without creating enemies.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's funny you say Latvia. I actually raced some motocross GPs over in Europe, and the team that I rode for was based out of Latvia.
Oh,
And so, and I did one GP there as well. And so
okay.
that's very interesting. I'm sure your family's probably a little tough over in Ukraine
Yeah, I mean, we
at this moment in
in
time.
we in the last couple of weeks, my siblings and I have put together a GoFundMe page to help our Ukrainian relatives, some of whom have come over to Austria. I have a sister there.
Oh,
They've
okay.
come to Austria, and so we're trying to get them set up with apartments, schools, being near train stations, and so forth, so they can get around, helping them to find jobs. And raising money so that they can have some wherewithal to pay rent and so forth when the time comes. So they've been, so my sister's been helping with that. We also have a couple of cousins who are in Western Ukraine who have a nonprofit organization where they're helping provide food and shelter, bedding, beds for people who are actually in transit to the West. So they're like kind of the final stop before heading into, say, Poland. So we're trying to raise funds for those who are in need, relatives, and also those relatives who are trying to help others who are in need, and even getting bulletproof vests and
Oh,
helmets and
wow.
so
Yeah.
forth too. So we're trying to help. Yeah, just heard from about one of my relatives who's been driving around all these bombed out roads to basically help some of these refugees, bring them back to where he and his two cousins are providing shelter and clothing for them, and food for them as well. So yeah, we're just trying to get the word out and let people know about what's happening there. And so we're glad to have some opportunity to be involved in this manner.
Yeah. Well, prayers for your family and friends that are over there. That's
Yeah,
for
well, thank
sure.
you. Appreciate that.
Have you done much debates throughout the years at
I've
all?
I've
Or?
done a few. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I'm not the debating kind.
Hmm.
It's literally
Not a
not my
William Lane
temperament.
Craig
I mean,
or.
I'll have, I've had various discussions. Like, for example, I did this 3 views book that I mentioned on Christianity and science, and one of them is an agnostic by the name of Michael Ruse, who's a philosopher of science, and so in light of that book, I had a conversation debate with him on a couple of podcasts, and it was really great. I enjoyed it, and it went well. But that's really not where I tend to get involved.
Yeah.
But I'm glad for conversations and things that are a bit more maybe natural, and rather than um, butting heads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just happy to have conversations.
Yeah. The dialogue and exchange
Mhm.
ideas on
Yeah,
that end and stuff.
yeah.
Absolutely. No, that sounds good. And trying to think of anything else that goes on. You have any other kind of words?
Well, I think just I thank you for having me on the program. I hope the viewers will take a look at some of the things that I've written, because I do, these are things that I've wrestled with and have tried
Yeah.
to uh, come to a deeper understanding of these issues, offer a context for some of these passages that are often thrown into our faces, and uh, it does require some concentration,
Yeah. Oh,
requires some
absolutely.
attention to the context, to looking at the ancient world, rather than superimposing our own modern world and expectations upon an ancient culture. And so things that were priorities for them,
Yeah.
things related to ritual purity, or to order and stability, and that sort of a thing. These are different from privacy, sexual freedom, to even democracy, as we understand it now. Lots of things, emphasis on liberty and privacy and so
Hmm.
forth. Well, those just weren't priorities for people
Yeah.
back then.
Most people
And
are just trying to survive at that particular moment in time.
yeah, trying to survive,
Mm.
and trying to and saw the good that that a government could bring in terms of creating order and
Yeah.
stability. So and again, obviously we're seeing that sort of a thing in in Ukraine right now, where order and stability are very important, and that chaos, when chaos reigns, it's harmful for everyone. Of course, the invaders themselves are part of, of course, the leading problem here. But again, we, those are some things that I would encourage the viewers to note and do some deeper digging yourselves. But hopefully my books will serve as a helpful guide along the way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, just one more note as far as, you're talking about relativism earlier. And, that seems to be exceptionally popular among the younger generation, the millennials and Generation Z. And most people I talk to about that kind of stuff, they're like, well, just let people live and let people do this. And it sounds good up front, but when you really dig down into it, what it does is create too much chaos, not enough order. You were talking about the order idea a while ago. And I feel like here in America, that's what's happened. We're collapsing slowly but surely. Violence has increased dramatically over the past couple of years, especially. And things are just getting out of hand, and there's no foundation really. There has to be some sort of order, some sort of progressive aim, I would say, as a society as a whole, for it to progress properly. And when you have too many ideas and feelings going around, and then it's aimless at that point, and you're scattered all over the place.
Yeah. And I'd use the term, since progressive can be misconstrued, I'd talk about maybe moral advance would be a better one. But I think you're right. I mean, we are, when you think about the book of Judges, where it says everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, those who claim to be relativists often depend upon the orderliness of society in order to get away with their relativism. That they can't be consistent relatives. They'll have to be relativists. They'll have to be selective relativists, because and even they'll tack on some sort of moral absolute on the end of their own relativistic statement, like you can do whatever you want, just as long as you don't hurt anyone. Well, where does that moral absolute come from? Or you can do whatever you want, just as long as it's between two consenting adults. Well, forget the consenting adults. Why not just do what you want? There is no moral standard to follow. Everything is relative. So why throw out those moral absolutes? Where do they come from? So those are important questions that we also ought to be noting as well.
Well, and it's funny you say that as long as you're not hurting anyone. It's like, well, what do you mean by that exactly? Because if you're just talking about physical harm, that's one thing. But if you're actually talking about psychological harm, like what's going on with transgenderism, rise of homosexuality, you look at the literature on that, psychological literature, what that does to children, and what children that grow up in homosexual homes and stuff. It causes all sorts of psychological issues later on in life, depression, anxiety, and increased suicide attempts and stuff. And you look at that and you're like, well, wait a minute. You can't do whatever we want. That's harm in and of itself.
And Mark Regnerus, University of Texas at Austin, talks about how a biblical, traditional, I mean, not just Bible, but even throughout the centuries and civilizations, father and mother provides the greatest stability and potential for human flourishing for children. And Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas at Austin has done a massive study on how, on every measurable level, children do better in the traditional, mother father home, and then any alternative arrangement that you might come up with, whether it be single parenting or gay or lesbian parents or whatever. Again, there really is no comparison. So the statistics do speak powerfully.
And you have the relativists and all these people on the radical left, I would say, promoting all these various things that create nothing but chaos and ultimately harm the young children, and that go on to become adults that have no aim or direction in their life. And it's amazing. I'm sorry. I was just going to say, it's amazing looking at scripture and looking at what Christ talks about and how idealistic it really is. And to think that was just created by, some, Far Eastern nomads or something, rather than actually having the God influence, is crazy, because it's so idealistic and functions so well overall for society. it's amazing, truly miraculous.
Right. And like I said, you have God meeting the people where they are. So there is some legislation that does assume that human beings will sin and be, but on the other hand, it is moving them in a redemptive direction. So,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely right. So anyway, take a look at the Moral Monster book, the Vindictive Bully book, and check it out for yourselves.
Yeah, again, thank you, Paul. I really appreciate you coming on. And everyone, go ahead and check out his book. The link is in the description of the video. And of course, you can always donate to my work as well to help keep the show going. We really appreciate it. And tune in next week. Thank you all, and God bless.